Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our community room in the Princeton Public Library and our audiences on Zoom. Thank you all so much for coming here on a beautiful day for this very important topic. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. I know that everyone is as excited as I am to hear our speakers today, so I'm going to be as quick as possible. This room is T-Coil enabled. If you have a T-Coil enabled device, you can turn it on now. We also have headsets, so if you'd like to try a headset, please feel welcome to grab one from the top of the piano. In order for the system to work, everyone needs to speak in a microphone to be heard. We hope to have time for questions from both the in-person and online audiences at the end of each panel. If you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A function. If you're in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. December 10th is the UN Day of Human Rights. We are celebrating by taking a deeper look at Article 25 of that declaration, housing is a human right. We have two panels responding to the questions, how did we get here and what can we do now? Both panels will run for about an hour, followed by an action fair where you can meet with some of the organizations in town and people who are working on issues related to housing. And I should just say, it's invariably you're sitting next to someone who's doing something amazing in town. We have a lot of stuff that's going on, so please take the time during lunch and afterwards to speak with your neighbors. We wanted to create a forum so that people could come and learn together, share thoughts, resources, and understandings, and envision a different future for ourselves and our communities. The housing crisis that we're facing is not going to be solved by a silver bullet or a single person. It's a community problem and requires us to find a more holistic community solution. There's so much I'd like to say, and so many people who have contributed to this program, many of them in this room. Thank you all. I will note here just our financial sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities and Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs in New Jersey. Thank you for making this event possible. This program is just one part of an ongoing conversation. The purpose of the program is to bring people together and help provide a shared understanding and identify possible next steps. Thank you all for being a part of it. It is now my pleasure to introduce our all-star inaugural panel. I have to say, every time they said yes, we'd speak, we were like, really? Thank you. Jacob William Faber is an associate professor of sociology and public service in New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service and holds a joint appointment in NYU's Sociology Department. His research and teaching focuses on spatial inequality. Laura Duranencourt is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University and a member of the industrial relations section of Princeton Economics. She is the founder and faculty director for the program for research on inequality at Princeton Economics. She works on labor economics, economic history, and the study of inequality. Douglas Massey is the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs with a joint appointment in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Massey's research focuses on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, urban poverty, stratification, and Latin America, especially Mexico. We are grateful to our moderator, Thomas J. Segru, a Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History and Director of the Cities Collaborative at New York University. Segru has served as an expert witness for several voting rights, civil rights, and housing discrimination cases and has been the president of the Urban History Association and the Social Science History Association. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks very much, Kim, for the kind introduction. I am thrilled to be here today with this extraordinary panel. Doug Massey, one of the most important social scientists of our time and a major scholar of race, immigration, and housing, and Jacob Faber and Laura Duranencourt, both rising star early in mid-career scholars who are really doing innovative work on the economics and public policy of housing. So as your MC this afternoon, I'm going to very quickly lay out the problem that we're going to be discussing today. I am going to ask each of our presenters to comment. I'm going to ask them questions, and we're going to run it sort of talk show style, and then we're going to open up the floor for comments from you all. But before I begin, I just have to say that you are in one of America's great institutions, the public library, and I want to thank the Princeton Public Library for bringing us all here. These are the kind of community gathering places that are essential to to nurturing our civic culture, our public discourse, and providing education for people of all generations. And so it's a real treasure, and I'm delighted to be part of this program here. So we are facing a housing crisis on multiple levels. The housing market in the United States is, to put it candidly, dysfunctional at the moment. Housing is essential for every aspect of the life course. Where you live determines your access to jobs. It determines your access to public education. It determines the quality of goods, public and private, that you have access to. Housing and the quality of your housing is strongly correlated with health outcomes. It is closely related to household wealth. That is, housing is the primary asset in most Americans' portfolios, along maybe with stocks and bonds or retirement accounts, and it's absolutely critical to intergenerational economic opportunity and success. So this is a high-stakes issue, and a high-stakes issue where we are confronting simultaneously an immediate crisis, one that began in 2008 and was exacerbated by the pandemic of 2020, and a long-term crisis that has to do with failures in public policy and real deep structural problems in the housing market. So as home sales have boomed in the last few years, and it's been an extraordinary market, at least until the last few months, if you are a seller in particular, active housing listings have dropped, and median home sale prices have skyrocketed. At the very same time, the number of listings on the market right now in the United States is at a near low in terms of the market. The median price for a house for sale right now in the United States, these are data coming from early 2022, so the numbers are shifting constantly, has jumped more than 25% since 2019. A huge increase in a very short period of time. Home ownership rates are beginning to move back up a little bit. It actually increased in the aftermath of the pandemic, but it's not as high as it was at its peak about 15 years ago. But the rates of home ownership are very much differentiated by one's race and ethnicity. We still have very serious racial and ethnic barriers to equal housing in the United States, despite more than 60 years of activism, policy making, and litigation concerning equal or fair housing. So in the fourth quarter of 2021, to give you some numbers, 74% of white adults owned a home compared to 43% of African Americans and 48% of Hispanic, Latinx, or Latino Americans. These are persistent disparities that we have yet to adequately grapple with here in the United States, despite the substantial gains of the civil rights movement now dating back more than half a century. The rental market is perhaps in even a more serious crisis. Rental prices have outpaced inflation in the United States consistently, not just in this moment of a very significant inflation, and there is a rental housing shortage. There are about 25% of the renting population is paying more than a third of their annual income in housing costs, which means they're rent burdened, and a very substantial part of the renting population pays half or so of their income in rental costs, an enormous burden that makes it very difficult to save for all sorts of other aspects of everyday life, from transportation to healthcare to groceries. The rental market is also one that reflects persistent racial disparities in the United States. Younger Americans, particularly young Black and Latinx Americans, are disproportionately likely to be renters. Public policy in the United States, and we'll be looking at some historical perspectives in the next few minutes, has long favored single-family home ownership but it has also favored single-family home ownership for those at the top end of the income scale in the United States. Most new construction in both the market for sale and the market for rent in the United States right now is happening at the high end, which is exacerbating the problem of affordable housing for the majority of Americans who struggle to either rent or to buy. And public housing in the United States, in contrast to other parts of the world, including many of the most developed countries in the West, is woefully inadequate. There are, at most recent count, 958,000 public housing units in the United States. A very small number, a drop in the bucket given the need for affordable housing. In major cities like nearby Philadelphia, the waiting list can be 10 years or more to get into affordable public housing. About 2.3 million American households rely on Section 8 or housing vouchers that make it possible for them to afford some rental properties. But again, this is a very, very small number compared to the need for affordable housing in the United States. And there are other federal programs, in particular, another part of Section 8 that provides assistance to the elderly and disabled. That's another 2.5 million or so people. Again, a drop in the bucket in terms of need in the American housing market. And so this is the moment that we're facing right now. A moment where housing is really expensive both for buyers and for renters. There's a shortage of housing, particularly at the affordable end of the rental and homeownership market. Starter homes are largely a thing of the past in terms of new construction, and the policy regime that we have in place largely favors the best off and woefully or inadequately provides for the poor segment of our population and working and lower middle class families as well, who live in great insecurity as a consequence. So our panelists today are going to take us into the origins and the current housing crisis itself, and also point us toward the future. So I'd like each of them, beginning with Jacob to my left here, to offer their background to help us understand where we are and how we've gotten here.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I am just getting over COVID, so I asked you to afford me two things. One, I'm going to try to enunciate as best as possible, and two, due to a slightly foggy brain, I have a few notes that I like to read from my phone for this point. So again, this is I'm in full agreement with Tom about the state of the multiple housing crises facing all of us. I would contest the framing of these crises as dysfunctional. I would argue that the multiple housing markets that we have in the United States today are highly functional. They are just highly functional for a very select portion of the United States, and as designed. And I would like to focus some of my opening statement on the sociopolitical costs of the fact that we as a nation have adopted home equity as the primary tool for wealth accumulation, because we don't often talk about the negative aspects of that. And one really positive trend over the past 5 to 10 years is that we have a much better collective understanding of the historical inequalities caused by federal policy during the New Deal through things such as redlining and restrictive covenants, et cetera, and the consequences that these interventions have had on segregation and housing inequality. We are still very much grappling with the implications of this choice that we made almost a century ago to make home equity this primary tool for wealth accumulation for most Americans, and especially low-income Americans and people of color. there are many ways in which this choice has made us terrible neighbors. In creating this really powerful incentive for homeowners to segregate. And we can think about this through many aspects of American life and how it's shaped by geography that Tom brought up earlier. But most directly, what it's done is it's tied our financial futures to the wealth of our neighbors. And so one way in which this is true is that the amount of demand for housing within your neighborhood inflates your own wealth. And also this operates through the uniquely American and completely barbaric practice of funding public schools through local property taxes, where again this enormous incentive is created for wealthy people to segregate themselves. And we've created this kind of paradox where we both need housing to be a great investment and affordable. And those things are in direct conflict with each other. Renters and aspiring renters want housing prices to go down, and homeowners want housing prices to go up. And again, these things can't exist at the same time in the same neighborhood. And so it has forced many communities to be extremely protective, and that term has an explicitly racialized history that is born out of these New Deal policies, the FHA, the GI Bill, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that encouraged racially restrictive covenants and zoning to exclude low-income people and people of color primarily. And this exclusion of certain segments of the population from certain geographies leads to exploitation and the kind of extraction of wealth from these excluded communities. And this is a very old story. Jacob Riis wrote about this when documenting the life of low-income New Yorkers in the late 19th century. W.B. Du Bois did the same in his research on Philadelphia. James Baldwin, multiple members of this panel, Princeton's Keontae Mountain Taylor have written extensively about the ways that historical practices of exclusion have led to economic and financial precarity for marginalized populations, especially African Americans. More contemporaneously, we have the example of the subprime lending crisis that was directly tied to legacies of redlining and exclusion that Doug and myself have written extensively about. And the other piece of this, again, is that we are, on one hand, better equipped with an historical understanding of these policies and their legacy, but still grappling with the moral responsibility that we collectively and individually hold for creating this, again, I would argue, intentional and highly functional a series of interacting systems that create these opportunities for exacerbating racial inequality. And I won't. One way that we try to separate ourselves from this is to kind of imagine this again as a kind of historical only situation. But our proximity to this is much closer. And one way of thinking about this, and I won't ask people to kind of out themselves, but if you had white relatives who bought property in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, they almost certainly agreed to a racist restrictive covenant. they almost assuredly signed one and agreed to not sell property to people of color, to the wrong European immigrants, to Jews, etc. And so what does that mean to have inherited from that practice for us individually and again collectively? I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. For someone who has COVID fog, you're very persuasive in your arguments. Laura.
Thank you so much, and thanks for those great comments.
Oh, your microphone.
Oh, my microphone.
Turn it on.
Testing.
Yes. So I'm an economic historian, and I want to kind of take this problem of housing market inequality, housing wealth inequality, and kind of kick it a step back in time and a step back to the idea of just wealth in general. So I think it was very powerful what you said, Jacob, about, one of the fundamental issues is pushing home equity as a form of wealth building. But we could even go a step further and say, what is the role of private wealth in our society? Wealth serves as this form of insurance against shocks, sudden job loss, illness, etc. It's a way to invest in the next generation, and private wealth leads to just dramatic forms of inequality. And this is directly linked to the problem in housing wealth, housing inequality, as is the politics of race in the US. So that's kind of how I want to approach this question, is to think about how racial politics have shaped housing inequality and how housing markets have perpetuated deep forms of racial inequity. Housing does make up, again, as a result of decades and decades of policy, housing does make up the bulk of wealth for the typical American family. For the average Black household, housing makes up 2/3 of overall wealth. By contrast, for the average white household, that's more like 40%, with business wealth and equity making up most of the rest. At the same time, the median Black household, so a household at the middle of the Black wealth distribution, does not own their home. That came across when Tom mentioned that just 43% of Black Americans own their home. So taking this kind of a step back historically, Black wealth building in the US began centuries after European settlers began claiming land and building wealth. In 1860, when 90% of Black Americans were still enslaved, the average Black American held just 2 cents for every white dollar of wealth. In 1870, just 5 years after the end of the Civil War, Black per capita wealth tripled. And that happened through newly emancipated Black Americans defying all odds and rapidly accumulating wealth through land, primarily. But that was faced with a severe backlash as Southern elites reclaimed the South and ended the US's very brief experiment with radical Reconstruction, changing the structure of society. And progress on racial equality started reversing at that point. As the regime of racial terror that we know as Jim Crow kind of reached its pinnacle in the South, at the same time, in the more industrial North, what was happening is that an important cheap source of labor, which was European immigrant labor, was being cut off during World War I. And that meant that industrialists started turning towards Black workers as an alternative source of labor. So those two things combined prompted a mass exodus of Black Americans out of the South and into cities in the Northwest and Midwest of this country. This is a phenomenon known as the Great Migration. It intensified with World War II and increased industrial demand. And it transformed the very nature of some of our most famous cities, Chicago, New York, Philly, and the great cities that then became sort of our post-industrial centers, Detroit, Baltimore, etc. Now, what the Great Migration did in terms of income and racial income convergence was phenomenal. Black workers could double their earnings, leaving a largely agricultural poor region that was the South at the time and moving to these industrial centers. But that increase in income could not be translated into intergenerational gains, once again because of the backlash that the Black community faced in these new cities. Black migration was met with extreme backlash in the North as well, and increased white flight, the rise of these exclusive suburbs meant two things for housing markets. First, that the areas where Black Americans could rent, was increasingly confined, which meant that rents were rising in those areas. At the same time, those neighborhoods that underwent what we would call racial transition, moving from majority white to majority Black, saw house prices plummet. So that meant that Black workers who had managed to buy into those urban areas and actually own homes saw their house prices fall, but newer, poorer arrivals couldn't ever convert their earnings into savings to buy a home because of the extremely high rents that they faced. The other way that the Great Migration shaped housing markets, and this is based on some recent research by a PhD candidate at Penn, actually, Tom Tsui, is that the Great Migration actually led to a rise in exclusionary zoning. So those places that experienced this deep transformation of their racial demographics started increasingly seeing these minimum lot size requirements and restrictions on building. So that's another way that the Great Migration has shaped our housing markets and this kind of crisis of housing supply today. The sort of last thing I want to mention is that when we ask what can be done to sort of mitigate this type of inequality and the role of housing markets and racial inequality, I want to emphasize that the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow can't be dealt with minor reforms in housing, capital, or labor markets. The average Black household today has about 17 cents for every white dollar of wealth. That's actually the same as it was in 1950. So we are trapped in this kind of persistent high wealth gap based on where we started, based on that enormous gap that existed at the turn of the 20th century, and that was exacerbated through this reaction to emancipation known as Jim Crow. So if we want to sort of address the crisis in housing and the crisis in all other forms of inequality that are produced through this distribution of wealth, then we really have to start thinking bigger into sort of large reparational transfers for past harm as at least a first step. And then all of our favorite kind of solutions in terms of financial literacy or housing vouchers or encouraging savings behavior, they can actually have more bite once the playing field is more equal.
Thank you, Laura. Again, with both of these comments, we see the critical long-term impact of historical processes and historical legacies. The past isn't past. It's very much structuring and shaping people's opportunities today. And those opportunities have been studied extensively by our last speaker, Douglas Massey. Doug?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to earn my PhD here at Princeton in 1978. I did a dissertation on, it was the first nationwide study of Latino segregation in the United States. And since then, I've been studying fair housing and affordable housing and what Tom calls the dysfunctional American housing market ever since. One thing I've learned in the last several years is that restrictive density zoning is one of the prime drivers of segregation in the United States. Prime driver of between inflated housing prices, prime driver of class segregation, of Black segregation, of Latino segregation in the United States. In many ways, New Jersey is ground zero in the fight for affordable and fair housing because of the Mount Laurel case. When I was in graduate school here in the late 70s, the Mount Laurel case was just proceeding through the New Jersey State court system. And in 1985, the Supreme Court here handed down the Mount Laurel decision, basically stating that no municipalities in the state of New Jersey cannot write their zoning regulations to preclude the construction of affordable housing under the New Jersey Constitution. And under the New Jersey Constitution, moreover, every community has an affirmative obligation to provide for their fair share of the need of affordable housing in the region where they're found. And this is state law in New Jersey. It's never been very popular among suburbanites and white people in general. Governor Chris Christie ran this, his first campaign, for his first term, on an anti-Mount Laurel policy campaign. And when he assumed office, he immediately pretty much stopped funding of affordable housing construction under the Mount Laurel program. And it stayed that way for about 7 of his 8 years in office until the Supreme Court finally ordered him to start spending it. We're only now beginning to catch up with communities like Princeton are only beginning to catch up with their Mount Laurel obligations after a long hiatus, caused the deliberate actions of Governor Chris Christie. One of my more recent research projects resulted in a book called Climbing Mount Laurel. I can plug it shamelessly because all profits go to fair share housing here in New Jersey for the promoting of affordable and fair housing. Basically, we did a study of what happened in Mount Laurel as a result of this decision. It was filed in 1969. The original lawsuit was filed in 1969 by a woman named Ethel Lawrence. And it wasn't until 2003 that the first housing projects, that housing project that resulted from that lawsuit, actually opened its doors in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Of course, by then, Ethel Lawrence had passed away, and they were named the Ethel Lawrence Homes in her honor. But the pathway to building this affordable housing development in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, was a rough one. There were very vituperative zoning hearings, city council hearings, public hearings, letters to the editor. I think probably a majority of people in Mount Laurel approved of the development, but the minority was very vocal and very outspoken in its opposition. But finally, it had no choice. They had to allow this project to move forward. So it opened its doors in 2003 with 140 units of fully affordable housing, 90% occupied by Black and Latino households. So I came back to Princeton as a faculty member in 2003, just when this was all happening. I thought, boy, it took them a long time to build this housing project. I thought, well, this offers a chance to really study the consequences of affordable housing. So we did a systematic study. We did a survey of all the residents of the affordable housing project, the Mount Laurel project, and then we also had access to the people who had applied and were on a wait list, so we could control for self-selection into the wanting to get into an affordable housing project. And we did propensity score matching, and we also did a study of comparing what happened in Mount Laurel compared to neighboring townships that didn't have 140 units of fully affordable housing. Basically, using a series of quasi-experimental methods, we showed that none of the terrible things that were forecast to happen because of the housing development, none of them happened. Taxes didn't go up, crime rates didn't go up, property values did not fall compared to surrounding townships in South Jersey. And so there was there were no negative externalities for the host community from Mount Laurel, New Jersey. It was integrated. It took a step towards integration. It was in terms of both racial and class, and it suffered none of these dire consequences that were forecast. Meanwhile, the people that moved into Mount Laurel, into Ethel Lawrence homes, experienced a huge boost in their upward mobility. We documented dramatic drops in poverty, dramatic drops in use of transfer payments of welfare. We documented increased rates of employment, increased earnings through employment. We documented a big improvement in mental health among people, big drop in exposure to disorder and violence within their neighborhoods. And for the children, we documented that they got access to a much better school system, moving out of places like Camden and Trenton into Mount Laurel, which is a good school system. And they did so without suffering any drop in their grades and with minimal disruption in the school system. It was a multi-method study I did with with a colleague from Wilson School, former Wilson School. I can't stop saying that. And
Sorry.
he was a terrible racist. He's a terrible racist. I teach that in my course on race and public policy. In any event, I did this with graduate students and postdocs and colleague, and included an ethnographic component done by a native of Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And so we got to know the situation pretty clearly. So what I think that book shows is that it's possible to implement a fully affordable housing project and put it in an affluent white suburb and give a lot of people, 140 households, a big boost in their welfare and upward mobility without causing any negative consequences for the host communities or the surrounding neighborhoods. When we did a survey of the surrounding neighborhoods, we found out that about half of the people didn't even know there was an affordable housing project in the neighborhood. So if it's done right, done correctly, it's part of the solution to what we're seeing today. One final note is that there are two ways to promote affordable housing. One is to build affordable housing. The other way is to use this Section 8 type certificates that Tom mentioned. And both have been shown to be very efficacious in improving the life conditions, the living standards, economic and social and physical welfare of people that use the certificates to move from high poverty, segregated, abandoned neighborhoods into more affluent, integrated neighborhoods, white neighborhoods. And they can be done without disrupting the neighborhoods. So there are solutions out there. It's a matter of political will that we do not fund them, and it's a matter of priority that we don't channel the resources that we need into these things. Indeed, most of the effort is on the opposite side of the equation, with people like Chris Christie trying to throttle a perfectly workable program that was a benefit for everyone in New Jersey, a benefit to the New Jersey taxpayers because it took poor people and it made them undependent and made them into taxpayers. It benefited the community of Mount Laurel because it integrated it without any negative consequences. And of course it benefited the people themselves. And so since it's a win-win-win for everyone, Chris Christie opposed it.
Well, thank you all for your opening comments. I'd like to ask a question that builds off of all three of these remarks. That is, we've now heard a brief and very compelling overview of the long-term effects of the marginalization of people of color, especially African Americans in the United States, going back to slavery and Reconstruction to the present. We've heard about the ways in which public policies and private real estate strategies, federal home loan programs and restrictive covenants have created long-term wealth gaps in the United States. And we've heard of an alternative, the Mount Laurel experiment, and others like it around the country that other scholars have documented have shown really significant gains for those who had the opportunity to move into better housing and better resourced communities. The question I have for all of you is, how can we scale up Mount Laurel? How can we devise, and what sorts of policies should we devise to deal with the decades or centuries of systematic deprivation of wealth to large segments of our population? How do we move past the dysfunctional or highly functional for a few housing market in the United States to one that is more fair and equitable to, especially to those who've been deprived of the resources of good housing and wealth for a long time? So, jump in.
Easy question. So one of the, you can say, good things that's come out, I think, of all this kind of cottage industry of research kind of documenting the long-term consequences of these federal policies. One of the good ways or positive ways of reading this research record is that we very much know what we did to create the inequalities that we have today. We created these enormous financial incentives for people to segregate we poured trillions of dollars into wealth accumulation for white households. And so we very much kind of can see a path out of this. But kind of independent of that, there are many kind of historical models for creating a more equitable housing system. And one of the examples that I often come back to is George Romney's inclusive communities. Is that what, yeah, inclusive communities initiative. That George Romney, when he was Secretary of HUD under Nixon, was at the time quite racially progressive, especially when it came to desegregation. And he came up with a plan to leverage the financial and jurisdictional powers of the federal government to break segregation patterns. And there were multiple prongs to this approach. One, he was going to use HUD's budget to build affordable housing for Black Americans in segregated white suburban neighborhoods along the model that Doug outlined. Two, he was going to offer mortgage assistance for Black households. And three, and perhaps most importantly, again looking back to Doug's comments, he was going to give, or rather use the power of the federal government to override local zoning decisions. Unfortunately, he was working for the wrong president. I don't know if we've had a right president for that policy agenda, but that was in the historical context of the last century, quite a radical vision for what the federal government can do in terms of building integrative, affordable housing.
What he was just talking about is the affirmative mandate of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, where the Congress told HUD, the new department headed by Romney, to break down the barriers to segregation, and they had to affirmatively do it. They had to go out and say to municipalities, we have federal money to give you, but you're not going to get it unless you come up with a plan to move towards a more integrated housing configuration, both in terms of race and class. But of course, this ran afoul of Nixon's Southern strategy and his racialized politics, and George Romney was pushed out, and this never happened. And no presidential administration dared to try to enact the affirmative mandate of the Fair Housing Act until the second Obama administration. It wasn't until the last year in the second Obama administration that Obama wrote the regulations to enact the affirmative mandate of the Fair Housing Act. And of course, the plan was that these would be approved and then carried forward under the Hillary Clinton administration. But of course, that didn't happen. And so they were scuttled, and the Republicans took over Congress. They floated legislation to prohibit the publishing of data on race and place in America. They didn't go anywhere, but that tells you where they're at. So,
including George Romney's son.
Including George Romney's son. Mitt's a shadow of his father, who was a very progressive guy, governor of Michigan, and big supporter of desegregating the unions, the auto workers' unions. So, like all things in America, it comes down to money and race, I think. So you need money to do this. We need transfer programs to offset the huge inequality that we've created in the United States, just massive inequality in the United States. Comparative data show that if you look at pre-transfer inequality, we're about the same as other countries in Europe and the rest of the developed world, the OECD. It's after transfers that we turn out to be by far the most unequal country in the OECD. So we just don't do anything to help poor people. Globalization and mechanization, computerization has created immense wealth, and the people who hold that immense wealth are unwilling to tax themselves even a little rate to transfer some of the money to offset the damage that it's being done in the rest of society. And it's destabilizing the whole society. And that's why you're seeing the rise of people like Donald Trump. In the history of the United States, two things predict nativist, racist, xenophobic reaction. And that's the coincidence in time of economic inequality and insecurity with rapid change through demographic change through immigration. When those two things happen, you get exactly what we're seeing now. And the only way to get around it is to attack the racism that still exists in American society, and to create a more a fair, more egalitarian post-transfer income distribution.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, since Tom, you said specifically, how do we scale something like the Mount Laurel program? And I guess I wanted to provide kind of like a cautionary tale, or also to push for directly investing in people and places, which is that, I'll bring up again the example of the Great Migration. It was the largest movement to opportunity in U.S. history, and people very rationally left a region that was suppressing them politically, economically, and socially, and went to a region where they, at least didn't face the same kind of legalized discrimination and had an opportunity to earn, to accumulate more. And then there was this backlash. And so I think we have to be careful. And it's interesting that you pointed out, when you asked people in Mount Laurel, do you even know about this affordable housing development? They said no. But what if people do start to realize, and what kinds of reactions would that provoke? And what we saw, at least in the case of the Great Migration, was this pretty fierce backlash and a withdrawing of white residents to exclusive suburbs. So I think there is value to, certainly these policies on a small scale seem to work really well and produce really good benefits for the very small fraction of people who have that opportunity. But on the flip side, we need to be thinking about how to lift up our communities. Just one example is, if you make the public goods good enough, integration will come. So a couple weeks ago, there was a talk by Rucker Johnson, who's an economist who studies education and race and the values of integration, and he was talking about how the introduction of free universal pre-K, actually brought families that would have sent their kids to private daycares into the public system and led to a form of integration there. Yep. And I think that's something that we really need to look at. If you make public goods, if you really invest in them, you will see the kind of integration that then has these other societal benefits. So I just want to put that out there as another policy to consider.
Yeah, probably the point is that you cannot just...
Wait,
I'm sorry.
we can hold.
I will, actually, we'll send the mic to you in just a second. Last time runs short. We started a few minutes late, so I think we can definitely make up that time on the end. But I think rather than continuing to go back and forth with the speakers, I want to open up the floor to you, because there are 100+ of you in the room, and I know some already have questions. So Kim will be providing the microphones and her staff, and we'll start with you in the front row, since you've got a burning question.
And if you could just wait, I know that this conversation, we'd all love to hear you for the next hour or two. If you just wait till the microphone's brought to you, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So right in the front row.
Yeah. Hi, I am Maria Cruz. So one of the things that for me is a frustration sometimes is we tend to look into housing and we tend to look into education, and I think that we need to put that together, because it's what you say about the pre-K. If you start from the beginning and bringing them up, it has to be together. You cannot separate housing and no education. So, and I will say another thing that is not very popular still, but it's housing, education, and health. And when you have that, you have a community that thrives. That is the issue that you cannot separate.
Does anyone want to jump in and comment?
Well, a lot of times people pose these potential solutions as either or, but they're not. So you can invest in poor communities and create public goods that benefit a wide number of people. At the same time, you have these mobility programs going on. They're different parts of the same thing, and that's the course of action that I've always advocated.
Thanks. This has been fascinating.
So one of the prime culprits of the housing situation, as you describe, is zoning. Minneapolis did away with single-family zoning. I'm not an expert in this field, so I haven't followed it that closely, but I'd love to hear, like, was that the magic wand? And if not, you know, what else can we do to address the issues that have been raised here? Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to say I don't know the answer to that question in Minneapolis. But one of my students here, Matt Melechko, has put together this massive database on actual housing policies all over the country, and it'll do a much better job of getting at the causes and effects of density zoning than my paltry earlier studies have done.
I will add that there are, because states are often the places where experimentation and public policy happens, there are some states like California that is beginning to rethink local zoning and permitting, for example, the construction of accessory housing or second residential units on what were single-family zone properties, as well as mandating greater density levels, because the housing crisis there, just like pretty much every crisis in California, is a foreshadowing of problems that are coming to other parts of the United States. And so we should keep an eye on what's happening there as well.
Mr. Faber, did you want to say something?
Oh, no.
I was very happy to hear this start with your thoughts about tackling the really fundamental problems that have caused I am taking care of a property in Brooklyn for my family, and what I have learned in the last 10 years is just eye-poppingly disturbing about even laws that are there to supposedly help. We have a few rental apartments. The rents are very low, and what I discovered dishearteningly was I can't keep them low. And it's going to get sold to someone who is a developer who will probably evict tenants, who will probably make millions on the property. And I realize that against the regulations and laws of New York, there's nothing I can do to stop that. Perhaps I can talk to you later about the details of it, because I really think that I'm hoping that someone is working on these problems. So I thank you for addressing some of the really fundamentals that I think have to be addressed, including taxes, a way to tax for schools, as I agree with you. I think it's barbaric, although I think it's a very touchy subject, but I think it needs to be discussed. Thank you.
I would just highlight that one relatively recent trend that we're seeing in the housing market, and primarily the rental housing market, is the mass purchasing of rental properties by hedge funds, et cetera, that began in earnest during the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis. So again, we have this link between historical disinvestment, vulnerability, that then again leads to another form of exploitation. And it's really terrifying to think about what this is going to mean for both the rental markets in many of these communities, but also the lost opportunities for wealth accumulation as properties get taken out of the market.
Excuse me, I'm a teacher in Princeton Public Schools at the high school currently. We have a lot of these issues big time in our town, in Princeton. These issues are very much an issue. I primarily work with Spanish-speaking students who are the backbone of most of the businesses in town, and facing incredible housing challenges. And I struggle with the way of communicating to the decision makers, the privileged, the wealthy, how it's in their best interest to keep people here who are actually, I mean, if my students disappear, this town falls apart economically, because it can't exist, the restaurants can't exist, most of the other industries can't exist without that low-wage labor, and there's very little in place, at least that's functionally working to keep our families that are at the most vulnerable levels secure and safe, particularly those without documentation, who are a large subset of the students who are affected at the high school with all sorts of these sorts of crises. And I just don't know how to effectively communicate that to decision makers how this is in everyone's best interest, because, I mean, not to get extremist, but I mean, history is written by a lot of angry poor people who rise up against governments and overthrow them when their interests are not being served.
Thank you.
I just had two things. I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. Rouse was successfully tackled some of the issues that you are mentioning. I just thought that maybe studying how he did it and doing it in this area might be beneficial, where everything looked similar, whether it was high income, low income, you couldn't tell. Affordable housing blended in with everything was taken care of. So it looked like everything was one. In school systems, everything was kind of integrated. I thought that the world was like that until going around to different areas and noticing that we were more progressive and the world hasn't caught up yet. I haven't seen too many places in the world that had his model or successfully did his model, which in the libraries and the public schools, everyone kind of benefited from what he put in place and still is benefiting now, which is one of the best places to live in the United States of America right now. I think it's like the 5th or the 6th. So the thing that he planted a long time ago, you're seeing a lot of that benefit now, and even the people that are moving to that area don't even understand it, and they don't, honor it, but it's still in place and it still works. So I just thought maybe following people who have successfully done it, whether government has put it into place or individual or companies, maybe that would be beneficial to this area. Also, we recently have come into this area noticing, with the housing voucher, a new one, noticing that there's discrimination on accepting it, whereas Columbia, Maryland, most of the apartment complexes accept the voucher. Here, they'll say they accept it, but then they say that you have an income requirement, which there's no way you can meet the income requirement, which kind of knocks you out. So therefore, you can't even apply for the area. And then they say you have to be in by a certain time and put in a certain deposit, so that knocks you out of even applying in the area as well. Or the stigma that you're not gonna take care of the place, which this is my first time with a housing voucher because of our situation or things rising. And I'm an educator. I have a bachelor's degree, well-educated, educated in Howard County, So, the stigma that comes along with having a housing voucher kind of prevents you. And that's not just here. That's most of the places that I have talked to in the United States, which took us, I think we got the housing voucher in June.
This is one of the, if I can jump in, and we have a few other questions, but thank you. This is, your story and the previous question point to one of the real challenges in the current housing market, which is that communities depend on educators, they depend on immigrant workers, and the housing, affordable housing available for them in many of the communities that are most reliant on those communities is really limited. So thank you. We only have a few more minutes, so let's maybe take a couple of questions together, and then we'll ask the three panelists to jump back in and offer some final words. And so there are so many hands. I'll let you take care of the call.
want to say
Well,
about that.
yeah, okay, and I also want to note that we do have a question online about the top 3 policies that should be enacted.
Thanks. I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to how monetary policy and Federal Reserve purchases of mortgages might interact with housing access and opportunity.
Okay, now Michael, here.
Yeah, just a comment and a question. You mentioned the Christie administration and its effect on COA. There was also another administration that basically put COA dormant, which was the Corzine administration, where they didn't approve any municipal plans and litigated it. Anyway, moving from that, could you speak to income stratification and how Mount Laurel was never structured to reach a certain level? You know, people making 16–20% of median income.
So I think we can ask maybe the 3 panelists to jump in at this point, and or do you have another? Is there another one you want to?
I think it's
Okay, so we'll ask the 3 panelists to jump in and respond to any of these rich questions, and then the online questions are, I think, a really good way for us to wrap, which is name a couple of policies that that you would advocate as we think about moving forward from the issues, not just repeating what the ones we've discussed already. So.
I'm happy to begin sort of maybe just take on that last question about, you know, what policies, but I think it ties into some of the issues that people have brought up. I think, you know, we've talked about housing vouchers and these kinds of programs, but in combination with other programs that kind of go along 2 lines. One is just kind of raising the basic wealth and income of the general population through what we would call universal policies, raising the minimum wage, you know, investing in public schools, investing in public goods that everyone can enjoy, and then that produces integration. But I think another policy, whenever we're talking about racial inequality in any domain in the US, you know, we just simply have to reckon with the history. It's not an accident that we're at a point where minor policies or trying to encourage savings or trying to encourage portfolio diversification, you know, the best that those types of policies can produce is to return us to essentially a path to equality that would take hundreds of years. And that comes out of where we started. So when we talk about racial inequality, we really do have to start talking about large, you know, redistribution of wealth to account for slavery and where we started.
Sure. So thanks again for everybody coming in for the million questions that unfortunately not going to be able to address all of them. But my in-laws live in Columbia, so I'm there often, and I think it's a fascinating case study for ways to kind of build a rather stably inclusive community. I will say, if you don't have a car, it's difficult to navigate in that there are many highways that kind of intersect all over the place. But to address the kind of voucher discrimination. So I've done research on this, and as your personal story highlighted, it's pervasive. We found that mentioning a voucher reduces the likelihood that a landlord will write you back by upwards of 20%. And it's also everywhere. There are many states and local municipalities that have passed what are called source of income anti-discrimination laws, where they've made it illegal to discriminate against voucher holders. Unfortunately, the research that I've done has shown that they are ineffective. And the pattern is very much in line with your own personal experience, that we see a huge reduction in the number of landlords saying we don't take Section 8, but you see a huge jump in the the likelihood that you get no response at all. So people just hide their discrimination, which is also the story of racial discrimination in the post-civil rights era, that people just move from explicit to implicit, as Doug is written extensively about. And where this often leads me in terms of policy is that anti-discrimination policy is impossible. It's almost impossible to identify when you're being discriminated against in the contemporary housing market. It's even more impossible to prove it in a court of law against a likely corporate actor who's going to out-resource you 1,000 or 1,000,000 to 1. So we should change the burden of proof. So Iceland in 2018 started requiring employers to prove that they did not discriminate in terms of income against women. They required employers to report income wages to the federal government because they realized that, again, it's impossible to identify it, let alone prove discrimination, and employers are repeatedly shown to be discriminating against women. We could do the same thing here in rental housing by requiring reporting of landlords, real estate agents, et cetera. We already have a federal framework for this kind of policy through the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which was passed in 1978, which requires basically every mortgage lender in the country to report information on every single mortgage application they receive to the federal government, including race, income, gender, et cetera, and what happened to the application. Of course, the lenders have been fighting the expansion of data collection there since its passage. But again, there's no way we are going to root out discriminatory behavior in any arena by putting the burden of proof on the victims of discrimination. And as Laura has said multiple times, there's no way to reach any kind of parity without reparations and redistribution of wealth. It's simply impossible. So those are my top 3 policies. Reparations, reparations, reparations.
Doug will give you the last word.
Well, in a way, Columbia, Maryland did influence what happened in Mount Laurel. Because it was a deliberate part of the plan not to build stigmatizing architecture. So they built townhouse-style developments and on cul-de-sacs, because that's what is in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. You don't want to put up a modernist, brutalist building with concrete in the middle of the suburb and you end up stigmatizing the people who inhabit it. So that was a deliberate part. They have a landscaping budget there. And there is a movement towards source of income, prohibitions on discrimination on the basis of source of income that is actually having some success around the country. And ultimately, I don't think we've ever really, we passed all these laws saying it's illegal to discriminate, but we've never really attempted to enforce the anti-discrimination laws. I had a moment of hope in 1993. Nancy Denton and I finished writing this book called American Apartheid about the history of segregation in the United States and its causes and consequences. And that was the first year of the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration. And he put in an activist, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Henry Cisneros. And Cisneros read American Apartheid and invited me and Nancy Denton to Washington, D.C. to give a high-level briefing to all the assistant secretaries and deputy secretaries. And we were working with Cisneros to create a testing program that would do audit studies all around the country using our data on where segregation was most intense as a guide to where to apply this. And that was moving forward, but then it got scuttled because in the midterm elections, Republicans took over the Senate and started defunding HUD. And then it was complicated by the fact that Henry Cisneros was paying his mistress payments to keep quiet. His political capital evaporated as well. So it's really kind of unfortunate. I thought we would actually move forward for a brief time in doing the anti-discrimination work. And the Great Recession prompted a massive amount, it revealed a massive amount of discrimination against black homeowners, particularly black middle-class homeowners, who were specifically targeted for predatory lending and systematically channeled into high-cost, high-interest loans when they would have qualified for conventional loans. And it's without a doubt, this racism is proven, and it was built into the structure of big lending institutions like Wells Fargo, and yet they pay a couple $1 million fine, and nobody goes to jail, nobody pays any real costs. So we let these things slide by, even though we know that the racism in this case was systemic and built into the business model of major financial institutions, and we did virtually nothing to stop it.
So Doug mentioned giving a high-level briefing in Washington, D.C., and I think what you've had here this morning is a high-level briefing from some really important scholars doing work on this critical area of policy. The very fact that about 12 or 15 more of you had questions to ask is a sign of how critical these issues are. Fortunately, the Princeton Library is sponsoring part 2 of this workshop beginning here at 1 o'clock with folks who are in the realm of housing policy who will continue this conversation critical to the future of your community, of this state, and of the United States writ large. These are issues that we have to be creative and we have to rely on really key facts and ideas from our high-level briefers. So thank you for your excellent questions, and thank you, panelists.